The year 1884 sighed out its summer heat in waves of dust that clung to everything. For 6 days, the dust of the Oregon Trail had been Clara Delaney's constant companion. It coated the inside of the rocking stagecoach, settled in the creases of her gray traveling dress, and lined her throat with a persistent grit. When the coach finally groaned to a halt, the sudden silence was louder than the preceding racket of wheels and hooves. The driver's calloused voice boomed. "End of the line for Silver Hollow, 10-minute water stop for the rest of you." Clara sat for a moment longer, her gloved fingers clutching the worn leather of her reticule. Inside it, nestled beside a small tin of pins and a few carefully saved coins, was the letter. It was the last of 7. Its paper softened and creased from countless readings. She didn't need to unfold it to remember the words. They were branded onto her memory, a talisman against the fear that had been her shadow since leaving St. Louis. She was a seamstress, a woman who understood the world through the language of stitches and seams, of mending what was torn and creating beauty from plain cloth. At 32, she was past the age of girlish dreams, her hands more familiar with the prick of a needle than the gentle touch of a suitor. Life had taught her that promises, like cheap thread, often broke under the slightest strain. Yet, she had crossed half a continent on the strength of a promise made by a man she had never met, a man named Elijah Boone. Their correspondence had begun cautiously, an arrangement brokered by a distant cousin who had moved west and spoke of men seeking respectable wives. The first letters were practical, filled with questions about temperament, health, and faith. Clara answered with a reserved honesty, describing her skill with a needle, her quiet nature, and her ability to run a household. Elijah's replies were just as straightforward. He owned a livery and freight business in a town called Silver Hollow. He spoke of long days, the smell of pine and horse leather, and the need for a partner, not a parlor ornament. His handwriting was stark and clear, each letter formed with a deliberate pressure that seemed to betray a man who meant what he said. It was in his 4th letter that the tone shifted. Clara, feeling a flicker of trust, had alluded to a difficult past, a period of sorrow in St. Louis that had prompted her desire for a new beginning. She had expected him to retreat, to end the correspondence with a polite excuse. Instead, his next letter carried a raw sincerity that had stunned her. "Mrs. Delaney," he had written, "I am not a man for polished words. The West doesn't care for a person's pedigree. It asks only what you can do and how true you can be. We all carry sorrows. What matters is that we carry them without lying about their weight." That honesty had coaxed a little more of her own story out, though she kept the heaviest part locked away. And then, his final letter had arrived, the one that had become her gospel, the one she drew from her reticule now, her heart hammering against her ribs as the other passengers began to disembark. She unfolded the single sheet of paper. Asterisk Clara, asterisk. He had used her given name for the first time. Asterisk. Your last letter spoke of shadows. I do not fear them. Silver Hollow is a simple place, but it is not a forgiving one. Tongues will wag. They always do, but they are not my concern, and they need not be yours. I offer you a new start, not an easy one. I offer you my name and my protection, such as it is. In return, I ask for only one thing, the truth. I don't care what your past is. If you dare to be honest, I will dare to stand by you. Asterisk, come on the westward coach. I will be there. Asterisk yours, Elijah Boone, asterisk. If you dare to be honest, I will dare to stand by you. Clara folded the letter and tucked it away, the paper a warm, fragile shield against the unknown. She had dared. She had sold her small sewing business, packed her life into a single, sturdy suitcase, and boarded the coach. But honesty. She had been honest in every word she'd written, yet she had not been whole, the most vital piece of her story. The secret that had turned her into a pariah in St. Louis remained unspoken. It was a truth so sharp and ugly that she feared it could sever the strongest bond, let alone one woven from nothing more than ink and paper. Taking a deep breath that tasted of pine and trail dust, she gathered her things. Her movements were economical, precise. She was not a large woman, her frame slender but her shoulders squared with a resilience born of necessity. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned in a tight, sensible bun, and her face, though pale with exhaustion, was composed. Only her eyes, a deep shade of slate blue, betrayed the storm of hope and terror within her. She stepped down from the coach, her worn boots sinking into the soft dirt. The station was little more than a rough-hewn cabin with a water trough and a corral holding a few listless horses. The air was thinner here, cleaner, and carried the scent of the vast pine forests that climbed the surrounding hills. This was Silver Hollow. The name had sounded like a promise on her tongue back in the humid, crowded streets of St. Louis. Here, under the vast, indifferent sky, it sounded like a judgment. Her gaze swept the small gathering of people. A few rough-looking men, a tired-looking woman with 2 small children, the stagecoach driver stretching his back. No one paid her any mind. She scanned the faces, searching for a man who might fit the stark, honest words of the letters. A man who looked like he smelled of pine and horse leather. But there was no one waiting, no one whose eyes were searching for a lone woman in a gray traveling dress. There was no Elijah Boone. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. Perhaps he had changed his mind. Perhaps he had heard some rumor that had traveled faster than she had. Perhaps this was all a fool's errand, the final, most humiliating chapter in a life of quiet disappointments. Clara stood her ground, forcing her spine to remain straight. She would not show panic. She had not come this far to crumble at the first hurdle. He said he would be here. She would wait. She smoothed the front of her dress, her fingers finding a loose thread at the cuff, and her mind, out of habit, began to calculate the best way to fix it. A small, blind stitch, nearly invisible. Mending was what she did. She had mended countless torn shirts and ripped seams. She had mended her own heart after it had been shattered. Perhaps she could mend this too. Her belongings were unloaded and set beside her the heavy, scuffed suitcase and a smaller bag containing her livelihood. Inside that bag were her shears, her thimbles, her spools of silk and cotton thread, and a collection of needles of every size, each nestled in a roll of felt. They were the tools of her trade, the only dowry she possessed. They were her independence. And with them, she carried her secret, the secret of a marriage not of her choosing, of a husband whose name was now spoken only in whispers of infamy, a man whose choices had stained her own name with a color she could never wash out. She looked up at the towering pines that ringed the small clearing, their dark green branches seeming to pierce the sky. They had stood here for centuries, silent witnesses to everything. They knew nothing of St. Louis, of society's brittle rules and unforgiving verdicts. Here, a person was measured differently. That's what Elijah's letters had promised. That's what she was clinging to. Clara Delaney, the seamstress from St. Louis, stood by her luggage at the edge of the Oregon wilderness, holding fast to a dead man's name, a pouch full of needles, and the written promise of a stranger. And she waited. The stagecoach driver didn't wait for sentiment. With a crack of his whip and a jangle of harnesses, the heavy vehicle lurched forward, leaving Clara alone in a cloud of settling dust. The sound of its departure was a final, fading link to the world she had known. As the dust cleared, Silver Hollow revealed itself. It was not a large town, more a single artery of a main street lined with raw timber buildings that squinted into the afternoon sun. A blacksmith's hammer rang out with a lonely, rhythmic clang. A woman in a calico dress paused in sweeping her porch to watch her. From behind the glass of the general store, another face peered out, then vanished. Clara felt their eyes on her like a physical weight. It was the gaze of a small, closed community, a look that weighed, measured, and judged in a single, silent sweep. They noted her unescorted arrival, the decent but road-worn quality of her dress, the way she held her shoulders straight as if bracing for a blow. No one smiled. No one offered a greeting. This was not the welcome of a town expecting a respectable bride-to-be for one of its own. This was the suspicious scrutiny reserved for an outsider, a potential disruption. Her heart, which had been a frantic bird against her ribs, began to beat with a slower, heavier rhythm of dread. Elijah had said he would be there, a man of his word, a man whose letters were stark and direct, would not simply forget. Something was wrong. Clinging to the handle of her suitcase, she began to walk toward the largest building, which bore a painted sign, Silver Hollow Hotel, Rooms and Victuals. The boardwalk planks groaned under her feet, each step echoing in the unnerving quiet. She pushed open the door, and a small bell announced her entry with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. The air inside was cool and smelled of stale beer, sawdust, and boiled cabbage. A heavy-set man with a sprawling mustache and a white apron stood behind a long wooden counter, polishing a glass. He looked up, his expression neutral until his eyes took in her luggage. "Afternoon," he grunted. "Good afternoon," Clara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I believe a room has been reserved for me, under the name Delaney, Clara Delaney." She watched his face carefully. At the sound of her name, a flicker of something recognition. Discomfort passed through his eyes. He set the glass down with a soft thud and avoided her gaze, his own dropping to the ledger on the counter. He ran a thick finger down the page, a pantomime of searching for what he already knew was there. "Ah, yes, Delaney," he said, his voice a shade quieter than before. "Paid for 1 week. Mr. Boone handled it." He did not look at her as he spoke, instead busying himself with pulling a heavy iron key from a hook on the wall. The simple act of him saying Elijah's name confirmed a connection, yet his demeanor screamed of a problem. "Mr. Boone, was he not able to meet the coach?" Clara asked, forcing a note of casual inquiry into her tone. The innkeeper, a Mr. Abernathy, according to a small, framed license on the wall, finally met her eyes, but only for a second. Elijah's a busy man. Freight business waits for no one. The excuse was plausible but felt thin, rehearsed. He slid the key across the polished wood. "Room 4, top of the stairs, to the right, supper's at 6. He turned away, picking up another glass to polish. A clear dismissal. The conversation was over. Clara stood frozen for a moment. This was not the welcome she had envisioned. She had imagined Elijah, perhaps a bit awkward and shy. But there, she had imagined a polite introduction, a shared meal, the first tentative steps of building a life from the foundation of their letters. Instead, she was met with a paid-for room, an evasive innkeeper, and a silence that was thick with unspoken meaning. Asterisk. There is something in the letters that was not shared with this town, she thought, the realization dawning with a cold certainty. Elijah's promise of acceptance had been a private one, a secret pact between the two of them. He had not prepared the way for her. She picked up her bags, the suitcase suddenly feeling twice as heavy, and made her way up the creaking staircase. Room 4 was small and clean, with a single window overlooking the main street. A simple iron bedstead was covered with a patchwork quilt, and a porcelain basin and pitcher sat on a small washstand. It was Spartan, but it was a refuge. She set down her bags and went to the window, peering down at the town that was meant to be her new home. She could see the blacksmith shop, the general store, the livery stable at the far end of the street that must be Elijah's. Life moved at a slow, deliberate pace. A wagon rumbled past, its driver giving the hotel a long, curious look. The woman who had been sweeping was now talking to another woman, both of them casting glances up toward her window. They knew her name, and her name was attached to a story she hadn't told yet, but how St. Louis was 1,000 miles of dust and rock away. News traveled, of course, but for the story of a humble seamstress's disgraced husband to reach this remote pocket of Oregon, it seemed impossible. A deep sense of injustice mingled with her fear. She had come here for a clean slate, a place where her past was not the first and only thing people saw. Elijah had promised her that. "I don't care what your past is." But the town clearly did. She needed an answer. She could not wait in this room, a prisoner of speculation. She washed the dust from her face and hands, tidied her hair, and put on her bonnet. She would walk through this town. She would not hide. Let them stare. Her posture, as she descended the stairs and stepped back out onto the boardwalk, was that of a woman going to a business appointment, not one walking into a den of judgment. She walked past the general store, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the eyes following her. She continued until she reached a small bench under the shade of a large oak tree, where an older woman sat, her hands busy with some mending of her own. The woman was perhaps in her late 60s, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She looked up as Clara approached, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Good day," Clara said, her voice calm and polite. The woman nodded slowly, her gaze taking in every detail of Clara's appearance. "You must be the one from the coach." It was not a question. My name is Clara Delaney." "I'm Martha," the woman said, not offering a surname. "I know who you are." The bluntness was startling, but also, in a way, a relief. Here, at least, was an end to the pretense. "Then perhaps you can tell me something," Clara said, deciding on a direct approach. "I was expecting to be met by Mr. Elijah Boone. The innkeeper says he is busy, but I feel there is another reason for his absence." Martha set her sewing aside in her lap, giving Clara her full, undivided attention. She looked at Clara not with malice, but with a kind of weary, profound curiosity. "Mr. Boone is a man who keeps to himself. He's respected here, not well liked, mind you, but respected. He's honest, he works hard, and he doesn't meddle. For him to send for a mail-order bride was the first surprise. Most men in his position would have found a local girl." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But that's not what has the church sewing circle in a tizzy." Clara braced herself. "What is—" Then, Martha leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone, yet one that carried the weight of absolute authority. "It ain't a secret what happened to your husband in St. Louis. Child. News from the big cities, especially news of a sensational trial. It travels, people read the papers. We know the story. We know you're the widow of a man who was put on trial and found guilty of insurrection." Clara's blood ran cold. It was true. The secret was no secret at all. But Martha wasn't finished. She held up a hand, forestalling any response from Clara. "But that's not the thing. This town has seen its share of folks running from a bad past. What we ain't seen is a man like Elijah Boone inviting trouble to his front door. The fact that he knows what he knows about you, that he read those same papers we all did, and still sent for you to come all this way." She leaned back, her point made, her sharp eyes fixed on Clara's face, searching for a reaction. "Asterisk. That asterisk," Martha finished, picking up her sewing again as if the matter was now closed, "is what has folks whispering." The words of the old woman, Martha, echoed in the sterile quiet of Clara's hotel room long after the sun had bled out behind the pines, leaving the sky a bruised purple. Asterisk. The fact that he knows, and still sent for you, that is what has folks whispering. Asterisk. Clara had not gone down for supper. The thought of food was impossible, a lump of dough that would stick in a throat already tight with anxiety. Instead, she sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, her hands folded in her lap, watching the light fade from her window. The town was quieting down. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer had ceased. replaced by the distant whinny of a horse and the low murmur of voices from the saloon down the street. Each sound was a reminder of the life outside her door, a life she was meant to join but from which she felt utterly, terrifyingly separate. She had been a fool, a naive, desperate fool to believe that a few sheets of paper could build a fortress against the past. Elijah Boone had promised to stand by her, but he had not stood at the stagecoach station. He had promised protection, but he had left her to face the town's silent, collective glare alone. Perhaps Martha was wrong. Perhaps he hadn't known the full extent of the scandal, or perhaps he had, and upon sober reflection, had realized his mistake. He had paid for her room for a week, just enough time for her to rest before catching the next coach heading back east. Her foolish hopes packed away with her worn dresses. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped her. She was a seamstress. She knew how to cut her losses, how to salvage what she could from a ruined piece of fabric. She would stay the night. In the morning, she would inquire about the eastbound coach. She would not beg. She would not plead. She would absorb this failure as she had all the others, stitching the wound closed with the tough thread of her pride. Just as she was resolving herself to this bleak course of action, a firm, quiet knock sounded on her door. It wasn't the harried rap of a hotel employee or the tentative tap of another guest. It was deliberate, patient. 2 solid knocks that seemed to absorb all the sound in the narrow hallway. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. She stood, her palms suddenly slick with sweat. She smoothed the front of her dress, a useless, reflexive gesture, and walked to the door. Her hand trembled as she turned the iron key in the lock. She pulled the door open just enough to see. He was taller than she had imagined. The outline described him as tall, but it didn't capture the sheer presence of him. He seemed to fill the dimly lit hallway, his wide shoulders framed by the doorway. He wore a simple, dark work shirt, clean but not new, and dark trousers tucked into dusty, scuffed boots. He held a worn felt hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly with his fingers. They were large, capable hands, calloused and clean. But it was his face that held her. It was a long, angular face, weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw and a mouth set in a firm, unsmiling line. He was not a handsome man in the way of city gentlemen, but there was a stark, unyielding quality to his features that was more compelling than mere prettiness. His hair was dark, a bit too long, and his eyes were exactly as she'd feared and expected. They were a deep, shadowed gray, the color of a gathering storm, and they held no warmth, only a steady, searching light that seemed to look right through her. This was not the man from the letters. The man from the letters had offered a sliver of warmth, of compassionate understanding. This man offered only scrutiny. "Mrs. Delaney," he said. His voice was a low baritone, a gravelly sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "I am Elijah Boone." He made no move to enter, no gesture of welcome. He simply stood there, waiting. Clara found her voice, though it came out as a whisper. "Mr. Boone." She opened the door wider, a silent invitation. He stepped inside, and the small room immediately felt smaller, crowded by his presence. He did not sit. He stood near the door, his hat still in his hands, his gaze sweeping the room, once taking in her suitcase, her sewing bag, the untouched pitcher of water before settling back on her. The air crackled with the things not being said, the apologies not offered, the welcome not given. Finally, he spoke again, his voice as level and direct as his gaze. "The coach arrived on time. I trust." "It did," she managed. "The room is satisfactory." "It is, thank you." The stilted pleasantries hung between them, thin and brittle. Clara's mind raced. Why was he here now? Why the cold distance? Why the interrogation in his eyes? As if hearing her thoughts, he cut through the pretense. "Everything you wrote in your letters," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. Was it the truth? The question was a physical blow. It was not. "I'm sorry I was not there to meet you." It was not. "I hope your journey was not too difficult." It was an immediate, unvarnished challenge to her integrity, the foundation of their entire arrangement. Clara's chin lifted. She had been honest in her words, if not in her omissions. "I did not write any falsehoods, Mr. Boone." "That is not what I asked," he countered, his voice losing none of its quiet intensity. "I asked if it was the truth." She faltered, her gaze dropping for a second to the floorboards. She looked back up, meeting his unwavering stare. "A letter cannot hold a person's entire life," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I answered your questions about my skills, my health, my temperament. In that, I was truthful. But there are things I did not say." He gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if she had just confirmed his deepest suspicion. He took a step closer, and Clara had to fight the urge to step back. The scent of pine and horse leather, the very smell she had imagined from his letters, clung to him. But it was not comforting. It was earthy, real, and intimidating. "I am a simple man, Mrs. Delaney," he said, his voice dropping even lower, forcing her to lean in to hear. "I have no time for half-truths. A thing is either true or it is not. I have brought you 1,000 miles from your home based on the words you wrote. I have made myself the subject of every gossip in this town by doing so. Now, I will ask you one more time, and I expect a plain answer. Is there an ugly truth you carried with you all the way from St. Louis?" The words hung in the air. Asterisk, an ugly truth. He had named it perfectly. It was ugly. It was a stain that had seeped into the very fabric of her life, one she could never scrub out. She looked at his hard, unyielding face. There was no mercy in it, no softness. But there was something else, a demand for a strength that matched his own. He was not offering her pity. He was offering her a single, terrifying chance to meet him on his own terms, absolute, unvarnished honesty. All the fear, all the humiliation of the day coalesced into a single point of decision. She could lie, she could soften the story, prevaricate, and perhaps buy herself a little time. But she knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that this man would see through it. He would see the lie in her eyes, hear it in her voice, and she would lose the one thing she might still have his respect. His letters had promised he would stand by her if she dared to be honest. It was the only currency she had left. She took a breath, the air in the small room feeling thick and suffocating. Her voice, when it came, was stripped of all artifice, raw and brittle. "Yes," she whispered. She saw a flicker in his eyes, the only change in his stoic expression. He waited. She swallowed against the stone in her throat. "My husband, the man I wrote of, who passed away 2 years ago." She had to force the next words out. "He did not die of a fever. He was tried and hanged for insurrection against the government." The confession fell into the silence of the room, stark and final. She did not cry. She did not look away. She held his gaze, her entire future balanced on his reaction. She expected. She didn't know what she expected. A flare of anger, a look of disgust, a quiet, final turn as he walked out the door, leaving her to her fate. Elijah Boone did none of those things. He simply stood there, his stormy gray eyes fixed on her face, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. The silence stretched on, a taut wire of suspense. He seemed to be weighing her words, weighing asterisk her asterisk against some internal, invisible scale. Then, slowly, he released a long, quiet breath, a breath he seemed to have been holding since he walked through the door. The rigid set of his shoulders relaxed. Just a fraction. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "I wanted the truth," he said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of judgment or surprise. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then his gaze drifted to her sewing bag. He finally turned back to her, and the scrutiny in his eyes had been replaced by something else, something she couldn't yet name. It wasn't warmth, not yet. It was something more solid. Resolve. "The rest," he said, turning the brim of his hat one last time in his hands, "we'll figure out later." And with that, he placed his hat on his head, gave her another curt nod, and was gone, closing the door softly behind him. Clara was left alone in the sudden, profound silence, her own ragged breath the only sound in the room. Elijah Boone's promise to figure it out began not with a conversation, but with an action. 2 days after his visit, he appeared at the hotel just as Clara was finishing a meager breakfast. He didn't sit, nor did he waste time on pleasantries. He simply stated, "The old chandler's shop is vacant. The rent is low. It's small, but the light is good from the front window. You can work and live in the back." He laid a key on her table. Its iron form dark and heavy against the checkered cloth. "I've paid the first month. You will earn the rest." And with that, he was gone. It was not a gift. It was a foundation, a practical, unadorned chance for her to build something of her own, for the first time since arriving in Silver Hollow. A fragile tendril of hope unfurled in Clara's chest. She spent the next 2 days turning the dusty, abandoned space into a home and a workshop. She scrubbed the floors until the pine boards shone, washed the large front window until it sparkled, and arranged her meager belongings in the small living quarters behind the main room. In the front window, she hung a simple, hand-stitched sign *C. Delaney, seamstress, mending and garments made to order. Her skill was her only currency, and she hoped it would be enough to buy a measure of acceptance. Perhaps, she thought, if she proved her worth through hard work and quiet dignity, the town might eventually forget the whispers that had greeted her. She was wrong. The whispers did not fade. They coalesced into a wall of silent, suffocating judgment. It began in earnest the first time she went to the general store for thread and flour. As she stepped inside, the low hum of conversation among 3 women huddled near the counter abruptly ceased. They did not turn to stare, which would have been easier to bear. Instead, they simply turned their backs, a gesture of exclusion so complete it was like a physical blow. The proprietor, a balding man named Mr. Gable, served her with a clipped efficiency, his eyes focused on a point just over her shoulder. He counted her change into her hand without their fingers ever touching. The experience repeated itself everywhere she went. When she walked down the street, mothers would pull their children a little closer, their hands resting protectively on their shoulders. Men who had been talking would fall silent, their gazes following her until she passed. The path before her seemed to perpetually clear, as if she were a carrier of some unseen plague. Then came the nickname. She heard it for the first time from 2 boys playing with a hoop in the street. One of them pointed as she passed. "Look," he whispered loudly to his friend. "It's the Scarlet Widow." The name struck her with the force of a slap. Scarlet, the color of sin, the color of the letter branded on the adulteress in Mr. Hawthorne's famous novel. They had taken the red of her husband's rebellion and twisted it into a mark of her own shame. They had judged her not for what she had done, but for whom she had been bound to. The label was meant to isolate, to define her by her past, to ensure she would never be more than the traitor's wife. Her greatest test came on Sunday, believing that to hide would be to admit guilt. She dressed in her plainest, most somber gray dress, and walked to the small white church at the end of the street. She slipped into a pew at the very back, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross at the front. The silence that fell as she entered was absolute. Every head turned, every eye was on her. She felt the weight of their collective gaze, 100 tiny needles pricking her skin. The minister's sermon that day was on the parable of the foolish virgins, a pointed discourse on the importance of being prepared, of living a life of purity and vigilance against the temptations of a fallen world. He never looked at her directly, but every word felt aimed at her pew. During the final hymn, her voice was the only one she could hear, a solitary, wavering thread in a tapestry of silent reproach. When the service concluded, no one offered her a hand in greeting. The congregation parted around her as if she were a rock in a stream, leaving her to walk out into the cold sunshine utterly alone. Through it all, Elijah Boone remained a distant, enigmatic presence. He did not, as some small, secret part of her had hoped, stride into the general store and demand she be treated with respect. He did not confront the minister about his sermon. He offered no public defense, no words of comfort. His silence in the face of the town's hostility was a mystery, a void into which Clara poured all her doubts and fears. Had he misjudged the town's capacity for cruelty, or had he misjudged his own willingness to stand against it? Yet, his support continued in its own silent, peculiar way. Every afternoon, just before dusk, he would appear at her shop. He never used the front door, which was for customers she did not have. He came to the back, where she kept her work table. He would arrive carrying a bundle, a torn horse blanket, a canvas feed sack split at the seam, a pair of heavy work trousers with a ripped knee. Their exchanges were brief, almost wordless. "Afternoon," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "Mr. Boone," she would reply, taking the bundle from him. He would nod, his gray eyes scanning the neat stitches of her previous day's work, which she always had waiting for him. He would place a few coins on the table, always a fair price, never a charity, and then he would leave. He never stayed. He never asked how she was faring. He never mentioned the stares or the whispers. But his daily visits were a statement in themselves. In a town where no one would associate with her, Elijah Boone, a respected if not beloved man, brought her his business, day after day. It was a lifeline, a quiet, stubborn act of defiance that no one could misinterpret. He was not endorsing her past, but he was validating her present. He was giving her work. He was giving her a reason to keep her sign in the window. He was, in his own stark and silent way, standing by her. One evening, nearly a month into her isolation, he brought a larger bundle than usual. It was a heavy wool duster, its sleeve nearly torn off at the shoulder. The air had turned cold, a harbinger of the coming winter, and the wind rattled the panes of her small shop window. She felt the chill seep into her bones, a reflection of the profound loneliness that had become her constant companion. He set the coat on her table. She noticed he looked more tired than usual, the lines around his eyes etched deeper. "A bad tear," she observed quietly, running her fingers over the frayed edge of the fabric. "Caught it on a hitching post," he grunted. He placed the coins on the table and turned to leave as always. But this time, he paused at the door, his back to her. "The work is good," he said without turning around. "Honest." And then he was gone into the twilight. The unexpected compliment, the first kind words she had heard in weeks, left her standing motionless, her heart aching with a strange mix of gratitude and sorrow. She picked up the heavy coat, and as she unfolded it, a small, folded piece of paper fell out onto the table. It wasn't a receipt. It was a page torn from a notebook. His stark, clear handwriting filled the small space. There were only 9 words. Asterisk, I don't care what they think. Do you asterisk? Clara sank into her chair, her fingers tracing his name, which he had not signed but which she knew as well as her own. The paper was a tangible piece of him, a connection that transcended the silence and the distance. She read the words again and again. It was not a declaration of affection. It was a challenge, a question that placed the burden of her own survival squarely back on her shoulders. Her fate in Silver Hollow would not be decided by the whispers in the general store or the sermons in the church. It would be decided here, in this small room, by her answer to his question. A single hot tear escaped and fell onto the rough pine of the table. It was not a tear of sadness, but of a profound, wrenching relief. She was not entirely alone after all. Elijah's question do you lingered in the air of Clara's small shop for days, a quiet but persistent echo. It was a question that demanded more than a simple yes or no. It demanded an act of faith. Her answer came not in a returned note, but in a length of deep midnight blue wool she purchased from Mr. Gable's general store, enduring his silent disapproval for the sake of the fabric. The annual Harvest Barn Dance was the social heart of Silver Hollow's calendar. It was a night when doctrinal differences were set aside, when hard labor gave way to the simple joy of a fiddle's tune. For weeks, Clara had heard the women who passed her shop discussing their plans, the new ribbons they would buy, the pies they would bake. She knew, with a certainty that left a cold pit in her stomach, that she was not welcome. To stay away would be the safe, expected choice. It would be an acceptance of her status as an outcast, the scarlet widow who knew her place. But Elijah's question had planted a seed of defiance. I don't care what they think. Could she truly stop caring? She didn't know, but she knew she was tired of hiding. Hiding had been her life in St. Louis, a slow suffocation of the spirit. She had not crossed a continent to build another cage for herself. So, she began to sew. The dress was her answer. She worked by the light of her window during the day and by the flickering glow of an oil lamp at night, her needle flashing in and out of the rich, dark fabric. It was a garment of profound and deliberate modesty. The sleeves were long and cuffed, the neckline a high, respectable collar that she would fasten with her mother's small silver brooch, her only piece of finery. The skirt was full but unadorned, designed not to draw attention but to convey a quiet, unassailable dignity. It was, in every stitch, a suit of armor. In sewing it, she was not just creating a dress. She was fortifying her own courage. When the night of the dance arrived, she dressed with trembling hands, looking at her reflection in the small, wavy mirror. She saw a pale, solemn woman in a dress as dark as a night sky. She looked respectable. She also looked utterly alone. For a moment, her resolve faltered. It would be so much easier to stay here, to read a book by the fire, to pretend the music she could already hear drifting up the street did not exist. Then she thought of Elijah's note and the quiet, consistent thump of horse blankets landing on her work table. She pinned on her brooch, took a deep, steadying breath, and walked out into the cold autumn night. The barn was ablaze with light and life. Lanterns hung from the high rafters, casting a warm, golden glow over the scene. The air smelled of hay, polished wood, apple cider, and roasting meat. A trio of musicians sawed away at a lively reel, and the floor was a swirl of colorful skirts and stomping boots. Laughter echoed off the walls. For a moment, standing in the wide-open doorway, Clara felt a painful lurch of longing for the simple, uncomplicated belonging she saw all around her. As she stepped inside, a wave of silence rippled out from the door. The fiddle faltered for a beat. The laughter closest to her died in people's throats. Heads turned. Conversations paused, and a dozen pairs of eyes fixed on her. The judgment was palpable, a cold draft in the warm, festive air. No one approached her. No one spoke. The invisible wall that separated her from the rest of Silver Hollow was as solid and real as the timber beams that held up the roof. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she did not retreat. She walked calmly to an unoccupied corner, near a pillar stacked with hay bales, and stood with her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She would not cower. She would be a spectator, if that was all they allowed her to be. She watched as young couples danced with breathless abandon and older. Married pairs moved with a more practiced, comfortable grace. She watched fathers swing their laughing daughters and mothers clap along from the sidelines. It was a portrait of a community, a life she could see and hear but could not touch. The music shifted to a slower waltz. A few more couples moved to the floor. Clara remained in her corner. a solitary island in a sea of celebration. She had made her stand by coming here. It was enough, she told herself. It had to be. And then, the great barn door swung open again, and Elijah Boone stepped inside. He had not come dressed for a party. He wore a clean, dark blue cotton shirt the same color as her dress. She noted with a strange little flutter in her chest, but his trousers were his everyday work trousers, and his boots were coated in the familiar reddish dust of his livery. He had clearly come straight from his work. He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room, his expression as impassive as ever. Several men nodded to him in greeting, which he acknowledged with a curt dip of his head. The women watched him with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Clara expected him to find a spot by the wall, to observe from a distance, as was his habit, but he did not. His eyes found her in her corner, and without a moment's hesitation, he began to walk toward her. He did not hurry, but his path was direct and unwavering. The crowd seemed to part before him, a silent corridor opening up in the middle of the dance floor. The whispers started immediately, a sibilant rush of sound that followed in his wake. Clara felt her cheeks burn. Every eye in the barn was now on the two of them, the town's most respected recluse and its most scorned newcomer. He stopped in front of her. He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of gray in his dark hair and the tired lines around his eyes. He smelled of clean sweat, leather, and the crisp night air. "Mrs. Delaney," he said, his voice low but clear, easily cutting through the whispers. "Mr. Boone," she replied, her own voice barely a breath. He offered no preamble, no explanation for his presence. He simply asked, his gaze holding hers, "Care for a dance?" The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. Clara's mind went blank. All she could feel were the 100 pairs of eyes staring, dissecting, and condemning. She looked away from him, her gaze flicking across the sea of hostile, curious faces, and then back to his. She had to give him a choice, a chance to retreat from the social precipice he was standing on. "If I say yes," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "are you prepared to be stared at?" For the first time since she had met him, the corner of Elijah Boone's mouth twitched, a small, slow smile, more a ghost of a smile than the real thing touched his lips, but it reached his eyes, chasing away some of the storminess she always saw there. "I'm used to it," he said. He held out his hand. It was a large, calloused, working man's hand. After a second of profound hesitation, she placed her gloved fingers in his. His grip was firm and surprisingly gentle. He led her onto the dance floor. The musicians, after a moment of stunned silence, resumed the waltz. The whispers around them rose in volume, a hostile buzz from the edges of the room. Clara felt a blush creep up her neck, hot and suffocating. She kept her eyes fixed on the knot of his collar. "Look at me, Clara," he said, his voice a quiet command. She forced herself to meet his gaze. His gray eyes were steady, a calm anchor in the churning sea of disapproval. He placed a hand on her waist, and they began to move. He was not a graceful dancer. His steps were simple and sure-footed, like a man used to walking on uneven ground. But he was strong, and he was steady, and he did not falter. As they circled the floor, the rest of the barn began to blur. The faces, the lanterns, the disapproving glares all melted into an indistinct swirl of light and shadow. The hostile whispers faded, replaced by the mournful, sweet cry of the fiddle and the steady, rhythmic thump of Elijah's boots on the wooden planks. Closer still, she could hear the sound of his breathing, and even closer than that, the frantic, desperate, impossibly loud beating of her own heart. He held her firmly, respectfully, and for 3 short minutes, in the center of a room full of people who despised her. Clara Delaney was not the Scarlet Widow. She was simply a woman, held in the arms of a man, dancing. The dance did not build a bridge. It drew a battle line in the dust of Silver Hollow. Elijah Boone's public gesture of solidarity had not softened the town's opinion of Clara. It had hardened it. Before, she had been a curiosity, a woman with a shadowed past. Now, she was a threat. She was the woman who had, through some unknown means, bewitched their stoic, solitary blacksmith and liveryman. The whispers that had once followed her like rustling leaves now stung like hornets. At the center of this newly inflamed hostility was a man named William Danner. Danner was the deputy mayor, a position that carried little real authority but which he wore like a general's uniform. He was a portly man with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes, a man who dealt in the currency of public opinion. He saw himself as the moral custodian of Silver Hollow, and Clara's presence, now openly sanctioned by Elijah Boone, was an affront to the tidy, predictable order he cherished. Danner was not a man for direct confrontation. His weapon was the insinuation, the carefully planted seed of doubt. He began to cultivate a new, more venomous version of Clara's story. He didn't just repeat the facts of her husband's trial. He embellished them, adding a narrative of his own creation. The story, as told by Danner in confidential tones over the counter at the general store or after the Sunday service, was this: Clara Delaney had not been a passive victim in her husband's downfall. She had been an active participant. He painted a picture of a cunning, ambitious woman who, upon realizing her husband's rebellious cause was doomed, had betrayed him to the authorities to save her own skin. She hadn't been a survivor, she had been a collaborator. "Think about it," he would say, leaning in conspiratorially. "A woman of her particular history. She arrives here with nothing, and in a matter of weeks, she has a respectable man like Elijah Boone dancing to her tune. It's the same pattern. You see, she uses men for her own protection, her own advancement. She led her husband to the gallows, and now she's weaving a web around Boone before he even knows what's happening." The poison spread quickly. It was a more satisfying story than the simple truth, for it gave the town a villain to blame instead of a victim to pity. Pity was uncomfortable. Righteous indignation was gratifying. They began to look at her differently. The coldness was replaced by a more active animosity. She was no longer just the Scarlet Widow. She was a temptress, a black widow spinning her web. Clara felt the shift immediately. The butcher accidentally short-weighted her portion of beef. A rock, thrown by an unseen hand, struck the wall of her shop one night. When she tried to ask Mrs. Gable a question about a bolt of fabric, the woman looked her straight in the eye and said, "We don't want your kind of trouble here," before turning her back. The weight of it was crushing. The first round of gossip had been painful, but this was a direct assault on her character, an accusation of malice she did not possess. She began to withdraw, the armor she had so carefully stitched for herself beginning to crack. She spent more time in the back of her shop, her face pale, her hands trembling as she worked. Elijah noticed the change during his silent, daily visits. He saw the new fear in her eyes, the way she flinched at the sound of footsteps on the boardwalk outside. He did not press her for details. He simply continued to bring his work, his steady, quiet presence a counterpoint to the town's growing hostility. One afternoon, he found her staring blankly at a rip in a canvas sack, her needle lying untouched beside her. He set down the coins for his mended trousers and, instead of leaving, he simply stood there. After a long moment of silence, he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "A storm doesn't ask the tree's permission to blow, but the tree decides whether to break or bend." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. It was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging her struggle. He nodded once, then left her with the strange, stark comfort of his words. The tree decides. The thought stayed with her all night. She had been bending, weathering the storm, but now she was close to breaking. Perhaps it was time to do something else. Her chance came 2 days later, on market day. The main street was crowded with farmers selling produce from the backs of their wagons and townspeople haggling over prices. Clara needed thread, and she had resolved not to let them starve her out of her own shop. With Elijah's words echoing in her mind, she put on her bonnet and walked into the heart of the town. As she passed the blacksmiths, Elijah emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw the grim set of her jaw and, without a word, fell into step beside her. They did not speak, but his presence at her side was a silent declaration, a shield against the glares that followed them. They saw Danner near the town well. He was in his element, holding court with a small group of the town's most influential citizens, including the minister and his wife. His voice was loud, self-important, and as Clara and Elijah drew closer, she could hear the tail end of his pronouncements. "A matter of public decency," Danner was saying, gesturing with a dismissive wave of his hand. "When a woman of such a tarnished reputation openly flaunts her influence over a good man, we must question her motives for the sake of the community's well-being." He saw them then. A smug, triumphant smile touched his lips. He had an audience. He had his target. He was ready for the kill. Clara felt Elijah tense beside her, a protective instinct radiating from him. But before he could speak, she took a small step forward. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on the confrontation. This was the moment the entire town had been waiting for. Clara's voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was perfectly clear and steady. It cut through the market day chatter like a sharp pair of shears through silk. "Mr. Danner." He gave her a condescending nod. "Mrs. Delaney, enjoying our fine town. I have a question for you," she continued, ignoring his sarcasm. "I hear you have become quite the storyteller, that you have been telling people my history." Danner puffed out his chest. "I believe in transparency. Madam, the people of this town have a right to know who they are living amongst." Clara took another step, her eyes never leaving his. "My history is a heavy one. Sir, I have never pretended otherwise, but I find I must object to your additions. You do not need to embroider a truth I have already lived." The words were a quiet rebuke, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. She was not denying her past. She was accusing him of lying. A murmur went through the small crowd. Danner's face flushed a deep, angry red. "How dare you?" he began, sputtering. It was then that Elijah moved. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped forward, placing himself slightly behind Clara, and rested his large, calloused hand gently on her shoulder. The gesture was not threatening, but it was unmistakably possessive, protective. It was a silent, solid wall at her back. He looked directly at Danner, his gray eyes as cold and hard as steel. "Do you want me to speak?" he asked Clara. His voice a low growl meant only for her. It was the offer she had been secretly longing for, the moment when the strong, silent man would finally vanquish her tormentors. All she had to do was nod. All she had to do was let him fight this battle for her. But as she stood there, feeling the solid weight of his hand on her shoulder, feeling the strength he so freely offered, she also felt something else, her own strength, rising to meet his. He had given her a foundation, a safe harbor, and the quiet encouragement to find her own footing. He had given her back to herself. The tree decides. She looked from Danner's sputtering rage to Elijah's steady calm, and she made her decision. She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Her voice, when she spoke, was filled with a new, quiet authority. "No," she said, looking back at Danner and the silent, watching crowd. "It's time I spoke for myself." The rain began in the afternoon, a soft, gray drizzle that turned the dust of the main street into a dark, slick mud. By evening, it had become a deluge. A hard, driving autumn storm swept down from the mountains, lashing against windows and turning the street into a shallow, fast-moving river. The wind howled like a grieving animal. and the world of Silver Hollow shrank to the circle of light cast by a lamp. The sound of the storm a constant, roaring reminder of nature's raw power. It was on this night that Clara Delaney requested the use of the church meeting hall. She did not ask for an audience, but she sent a simple, hand-delivered note to the minister, Reverend Miller, stating her intention to speak at 7 o'clock. News, even in a storm, traveled fast in a town starved for drama. It was an open invitation, a challenge laid down in the heart of the tempest. Curiosity, that most powerful of human instincts, was stronger than the rain. By 7, the meeting hall was nearly full. They came in 2s and 3s, shaking the water from heavy coats and stamping the mud from their boots, their faces etched with a mixture of anticipation and grim disapproval. They were farmers, merchants, wives, and laborers, the entire social fabric of Silver Hollow, drawn together to witness the final act of the Scarlet Widow's strange drama. William Danner was there, of course, seated in the front row, his face smug and expectant. Martha, the old woman from the bench, sat near the back, her knitting needles still, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Elijah Boone was the last to arrive. He entered quietly through the back door, dripping water onto the floorboards, and took up a position against the rear wall, his arms crossed over his chest. He did not look at anyone, his gaze fixed solely on the small, empty space at the front of the room where a single lantern had been placed on a table. Then, Clara entered from a side door. She wore the same simple, dark dress she had worn to the dance, her suit of armor. Her hair was neatly pinned, and her face was pale in the flickering lamplight. But her eyes were clear, and her hands, clasped before her, were steady. She walked to the front and stood behind the table, her small figure framed by the vast, unadorned windows through which the storm could be seen raging. The room fell silent, the only sounds the drumming of the rain on the roof and the whistling of the wind. Clara let the silence stretch, forcing them to look at her, to see the woman, not the rumor. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. It held no tremor of fear. "My name is Clara Delaney. Most of you, however, know me by another name, the Scarlet Widow. You have been told a story about me, a story of a treacherous wife who betrayed her husband for her own gain. Tonight, I want to tell you the truth, not to ask for your forgiveness, or your pity, or even your acceptance, but because I will no longer allow a lie to be the only thing you know of me." She paused, her gaze sweeping the faces before her. "The story begins not with betrayal, but with a debt. My father, a good but impractical man, fell on hard times. A man named Thaddeus Kane offered to settle these debts. The price was my hand in marriage. I was 19 years old. I was not consulted. I was sold." A low murmur rippled through the room. This was a detail Danner's story had conveniently omitted. "Thaddeus was a respected man in St. Louis," she continued, her voice remaining level, factual. "He was charming, wealthy, and politically connected. In public, he was a model husband. In private, he was a man who believed a wife was a piece of property, an ornament to be displayed and an asset to be controlled. My life became a cage, a very beautiful, gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. My opinions were not welcome. My friends were dismissed. My days were governed by his moods, which were unpredictable. I learned to be quiet. I learned to be invisible. I learned to endure." She looked directly at the row of women in the middle of the room, women who knew the small, daily compromises of marriage, and she saw a flicker of understanding in some of their eyes. Over the years, his politics, which had always been extreme, hardened into something dangerous. He fell in with men who spoke of purifying the nation through violence, who saw the government not as an institution to be improved, but as an enemy to be overthrown. His talk of rebellion became a plan for it. He and his compatriots began stockpiling weapons. They plotted to attack a federal armory. The rain hammered against the glass, a dramatic counterpoint to the revelation. I was his wife, Clara said, her voice dropping slightly. He expected me to be his accomplice. He ordered me to sew a new flag for his new republic. He instructed me to carry messages to his co-conspirators. He believed my loyalty to him was absolute, that it superseded my loyalty to my country, to the law, and to my own conscience. She took a breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the table. And that is where he was wrong. I had endured his temper. I had endured his control. But I would not be a party to treason. I would not help him bring about the deaths of innocent men. I refused. He did not take my refusal well. He gave me an ultimatum. I could stand with him, or I could be treated as an enemy. He made it clear what that meant. In his eyes, I had only two choices, complicity or destruction. She lifted her chin, and for the first time, a spark of fire flashed in her slate-blue eyes. I chose a third option. I chose to survive. 2 nights before the planned attack, I walked out of my house and went to the United States Marshals. I told them everything I knew. I told them about the weapons, the plans, the names of the men involved. I did it not to save myself, but to stop a bloodbath. I did it because it was the right thing to do. She let her words hang in the dead, silent room. William Danner's face was a mask of disbelief and rage, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling into dust around him. My husband, Clara said, her voice now ringing with a clear, cold finality, chose rebellion. I did not follow him. I reported his intentions to the proper authorities, and I survived. She did not cry. Her gaze was unflinching as she looked out at the sea of faces that had judged her so harshly. She had laid her soul bare, not as a penitent, but as a witness to her own life. The truth was out, a stark and unadorned thing, left to stand on its own merits in the center of the room. The silence that followed was profound. It was a silence of shock, of reassessment, of shame. In that moment, they were not judging her. They were judging themselves. Their petty gossip, their cruel whispers, their self-righteous condemnation all seemed cheap and ugly in the face of her stark, harrowing testimony. Into this thick, ringing silence, a pair of boots scraped against the floorboards at the back of the hall. Elijah Boone pushed himself off the wall. He did not look at the stunned faces of his neighbors. He did not look at William Danner. His eyes were fixed on Clara, and in their stormy depths was a look of profound, quiet respect. He began to walk forward, his steps slow and deliberate, echoing in the cavernous quiet. He walked to the front of the room and stood beside her, not touching her, but his presence a solid, unshakable affirmation. He turned his gaze, for the first time, to the assembled townspeople. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried the immense weight of his character. Truth, Elijah Boone said slowly, deliberately, is not for judging. It's for the decent to listen. He held their gaze for a moment longer, a silent challenge. Before turning his eyes back to Clara, he gave her a single, slow nod. And in that small gesture, she saw the fulfillment of the promise he had made in his very last letter. He had dared to stand by her. And in the heart of the storm, Clara Delaney, the seamstress from St. Louis, finally, truly, felt she had come home. In the wake of the storm and the reckoning, a fragile peace settled over Silver Hollow. The rain had washed the air clean, and it seemed to have rinsed away some of the town's bitterness as well. The change was not spoken, but felt. It was in the way, Mrs. Gable from the general store gave Clara a hesitant but genuine nod when she came in for flour. It was in the way Reverend Miller's sermons shifted from themes of judgment to those of forgiveness. William Danner, for his part, was a man humbled, keeping to his own affairs with a new and uncharacteristic quietness. The whispers had stopped. The stares had softened into looks of cautious, burgeoning respect. Clara's life found a new rhythm. Her sewing business began to grow as women, one by one, started bringing her dresses to be altered and shirts to be mended. They were small offerings of peace, stitched together with a thread of common courtesy. Her daily interactions with Elijah changed as well. He still came to her shop each evening, but his visits were no longer silent transactions. He would linger for a moment, his hat in his hands, and ask about her day. He told her of a difficult horse he was breaking or a freight contract he had secured. Their conversations were simple, grounded in the practicalities of their lives. But beneath the surface ran a deep current of unspoken understanding. He no longer brought her his mending, he brought her his company. He had stood by her truth, and now, in the quiet aftermath, they were simply standing together. This newfound tranquility was shattered on a cold, bright Tuesday. Elijah had taken a team of horses with a heavy wagon of supplies up the winding ridge road, a notoriously treacherous stretch of the trail. The day was clear, the work routine. No one expected trouble. The first sign came in the form of a riderless horse, one of Elijah's big grays, trotting nervously back into town, its eyes wide with panic, a piece of broken harness trailing from its side. A knot of dread formed in the town's collective gut. Minutes later, a young man named Silas, one of Elijah's livery hands, came galloping down the main street on the other horse, his face ashen. He reined his mount to a skidding halt, shouting for help, but he did not run to the doctor's office. He did not run to the sheriff. He vaulted from the saddle and ran directly, without hesitation, to the small shop with the neat, hand-stitched sign in the window. He burst through the door of C. Delaney, seamstress, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Mrs. Delaney," he cried, his chest heaving, "it's Mr. Boone. There was a fall, up on the ridge. The wagon went over. He's hurt bad. He ain't moving." Clara was on her feet in an instant, the piece of fabric she had been hemming dropping to the floor. The blood drained from her face, but her voice was preternaturally calm. The years of suppressing her own panic had forged in her an iron composure that now served her well. "Silas, listen to me," she said, her tone sharp and clear, cutting through his panic. "Go to Dr. Adams. Tell him what happened and tell him to meet us at Mr. Boone's quarters behind the livery. Then find 2 strong men and bring a wagon with the thickest mattress you can find. Go, now!" As the boy scrambled to do her bidding, Clara moved with a swift, practiced efficiency. She grabbed the sharpest pair of shears from her sewing kit. From her own trunk, she pulled out a stack of clean linen sheets, the finest she owned, and began tearing them into long strips for bandages. She filled a canteen with fresh water and grabbed a small bar of lye soap. In minutes, she was ready, her mind a fortress of practicality against the tidal wave of fear that threatened to engulf her. They found him lying where he had been thrown, halfway down a steep, rocky embankment. The wrecked wagon lay splintered below. He was unconscious, a gash on his forehead bleeding sluggishly, his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. The sight of him, so strong and vital, now utterly still and broken, struck Clara with a physical force that almost buckled her knees. But she pushed her grief down. He did not need her tears. He needed her hands. Under her direction, the men gently loaded him onto the makeshift ambulance. She rode in the back of the wagon with him, cradling his head in her lap, wiping the blood from his face with a cool, damp cloth, murmuring his name over and over in a low, steady voice, as if her words alone could anchor him to the world of the living. Dr. Adams was waiting for them in Elijah's small, Spartan room behind the livery. It was a space that was entirely him. It smelled of leather, wood smoke, and metal. A simple cot, a rough-hewn table, a shelf of account books, and a few well-cared-for tools. There were no decorations, no comforts, save for a worn copy of Shakespeare's tragedies on the nightstand. The doctor, a kind man with weary eyes, worked quickly. "The leg is a clean break," he announced as he finished setting the crude splint. "He's a strong man. That will heal. It's this head injury that has me worried." He gently cleaned the gash on Elijah's temple. There's no telling the damage within. All we can do is wait. Keep him warm. Try to get some broth into him if he stirs. I'll be back in the morning. He looked at Clara, at the determined set of her jaw. He'll need constant watching. I won't leave him, she said. It was not a promise. It was a statement of fact. And she did not. For 3 days and 3 nights, the small room behind the livery became her entire world. She did not go back to her shop. She did not sleep, save for a few minutes at a time in a hard-backed chair pulled up beside his cot. She became his guardian, his nurse, his silent, devoted sentinel. The town, in its own quiet way, rallied around her. Martha brought a pot of rich chicken broth. Mrs. Gable left a basket of fresh bread and cheese outside the door. Even William Danner sent Silas with a load of firewood, a silent, shame-faced offering of peace. They did not intrude. They simply left their offerings, acknowledging that this was her place now, her right, her duty. Clara's world shrank to the rhythm of his breathing. She bathed his face with cool water, fighting the fever that came and went. She forced spoonfuls of broth between his unresponsive lips, praying some of it would find its way down. She changed the dressing on his head with her steady seamstress's hands, her stitches on torn fabric now replaced by the gentle tending of torn flesh. On the second night, another storm rolled in, the wind and rain beating against the small building. In the dim flickering lamplight, with the storm raging outside and the storm of uncertainty raging within her, she began to hum. It was a simple, wordless tune, a lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child. She hummed it to fill the terrifying silence, to ward off the encroaching darkness, to soothe her own frayed and frightened heart as much as his. She was a beacon of quiet, tireless care in the long, dark night of his unconsciousness. On the morning of the third day, the storm had passed. A sliver of pale sunlight found its way through the grimy window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. Clara was slumped in the chair, her head resting on the edge of his cot, her hand loosely holding his. She was bone-weary, her eyes gritty with exhaustion, her spirit worn thin. She felt a flicker of movement in the hand she was holding. Her head snapped up. His fingers were twitching, a faint, barely perceptible motion. His eyelids fluttered. She leaned closer, her heart pounding. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. His eyes, those stormy gray eyes, slowly opened. They were clouded with confusion at first, trying to make sense of the ceiling, the room, the pain. Then they found her face. They focused, and a glimmer of recognition dawned. His lips moved, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. She quickly held a cup of water to his mouth, and he managed a small sip. He tried again. His voice was a ghost of its usual rumble, a weak, hoarse whisper. "You're still here." A wave of relief so powerful it was painful washed over Clara. The tension that had held her rigid for 3 days finally broke, and tears she had refused to shed streamed down her face. But she was smiling, a wide, tremulous, watery smile. She squeezed his hand gently. "I told you I was true," she said, her voice thick with emotion, but her words as clear and steady as her heart. "You said you only wanted the truth." She leaned in closer, her tears dripping onto their joined hands, her smile never wavering. "Well, here it is," she whispered. "I'm not leaving." Elijah's recovery was slow but steady, a testament to his own stubborn strength and Clara's tireless care. As autumn bled into the sharp, clear days of early winter, he progressed from his cot to a chair, and then, with the aid of a rough-hewn crutch, to the doorway of the livery, where he could feel the sun on his face. Each small step forward was a shared victory. Clara had moved her sewing work into his small quarters, her quiet presence a constant, comforting light in the shadows of his convalescence. A new, unspoken intimacy grew between them in the quiet rhythm of those days. It was in the way she would look up from her sewing to find him watching her, a look of quiet wonder in his gray eyes. It was in the way his hand would briefly, almost accidentally, brush hers as she handed him a cup of broth. They spoke of the future in practical terms, of the horses he needed to buy, of the winter coats she was commissioned to make. But beneath the simple words lay a deeper conversation, a silent acknowledgement that their futures were now inextricably intertwined. The town, for a time, seemed to accept this new arrangement. They had seen her devotion, her selfless care. The narrative had shifted from the Scarlet Widow to the Good Samaritan. But the peace was a fragile thing, a thin layer of ice over a deep, cold river of prejudice. And William Danner was a man who knew exactly where to break the ice. Having failed to oust Clara by attacking her past, Danner shifted his strategy to her present. He could no longer call her a traitor's wife with any credibility. So he found a new label, one that was, in its own way, even more insidious, a woman of loose morals. He began his campaign subtly, a word here, a question there. "It's a strange thing, isn't it?" he'd muse at the general store. "A single woman, living in such close quarters with a bachelor. It sets a poor example for our daughters." He fanned the embers of old suspicions, reframing Clara's compassion as cunning and her presence in Elijah's home as a moral trespass. He spoke of protecting the sanctity of the town, of upholding a standard of decency. His efforts culminated in a formal petition brought before the town council. The petition demanded that Clara Delaney be barred from conducting business in the central market square, a privilege granted to artisans during the run-up to Christmas. The official charge, penned in Danner's flourishing, self-important script, was moral provocation and conduct liable to corrupt the public decency. The notice was posted on the town hall door. When Clara saw it, a cold, familiar dread washed over her. She had fought one battle and won a reprieve, only to find herself facing a new war on a different front. The accusation was designed to be impossible to refute. How could one prove the purity of one's intentions? How could she defend an act of kindness that was being deliberately twisted into something sordid? The night before the council meeting, Elijah found her staring into the fire, her sewing forgotten in her lap. He leaned on his crutch, his splinted leg still a hindrance, his face grim. "This is my fault," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I brought this on you." She looked up at him, her eyes clear of tears. "No, Elijah, you brought me a chance. They are the ones doing this." She straightened her shoulders. "I faced them once before. I will face them again." "We will face them," he corrected her, his voice absolute. The town hall was, once again, filled to capacity. The atmosphere was different this time. It was not the raw, shocked silence of her first speech, but the charged, formal tension of a trial. Danner and the other 3 council members sat at a long table at the front. The rest of the town filled the benches, their faces a mixture of avid curiosity, grim satisfaction, and quiet shame. Danner presented his case with sanctimonious relish. He spoke of Silver Hollow as a beacon of family values, a place where standards were maintained. He described, in vague but suggestive terms, the impropriety of Mrs. Delaney's living situation. He never used coarse language. He didn't have to. His insinuations did the work for him, painting a picture of a calculating woman taking advantage of a man in his moment of weakness. "It is not her past we are judging today," he concluded, his voice ringing with false piety. "It is her present, and the dangerous example she sets. We must ask ourselves, is this the standard of conduct we want displayed in our public square?" When he finished, a smattering of applause broke out, mostly from a small, tight-lipped contingent of the church sewing circle. The council chairman, a nervous man named Henderson, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Delaney, do you wish to speak in your own defense?" All eyes turned to her. She rose from her seat in the front row and walked to the center of the room. She did not approach the council's table. She stood in the aisle, among the people. She was not a defendant pleading her case. She was a member of the community addressing her peers. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood, straight and tall, and let her gaze move from one face to another, meeting their eyes directly. "My name is Clara Delaney," she began, her voice as steady and clear as a winter morning. "You know my history. I told it to you myself in this very room. I told you that I was a woman who was wronged, and who survived." She paused, letting the words settle. "Now, a man I respect, a man who showed me kindness when no one else would, was gravely injured. I cared for him. I nursed him back from the edge of death. I did so because it was the humane thing to do. It was the decent thing to do." Her eyes found Danner's. "Mr. Danner wishes to call my actions moral provocation. He wishes to twist an act of compassion into something ugly and shameful. He is not doing this to protect the town's decency. He is doing it because he is offended by a woman who does not fit his idea of what a woman should be. A woman who is not a wife or a daughter. A woman who stands on her own." She turned her gaze back to the crowd. "My life has not been easy. I have known pain, I have known betrayal, and I have learned to survive. If the truth of that survival, if the fact that I am a woman who has endured and who will not be broken, makes you uncomfortable." She took a deep breath, her voice ringing with a quiet, unshakable power. "Then I do not apologize, but I will not back down, either." She finished and stood in the deafening silence, her head held high. Before the chairman could even speak, there was a sound from the front row, a scrape of wood on wood. Elijah Boone, with grim determination, was pushing himself to his feet. He gripped his crutch, his knuckles white, and with a visible effort that sent a flash of pain across his face. He stood. He limped the few steps into the aisle and came to a stop beside her. He did not speak. He did not have to. He simply stood with her, a man on a crutch, his splinted leg a testament to the very reason she was being condemned, his presence an irrefutable testament to his faith in her. The chairman, flustered, called for the vote. "All in favor of the motion to bar Mrs. Delaney from the market square." Danner's hand shot up, along with two other councilmen. The motion passed, 3-1. A gasp went through the room. Martha, from the back, muttered, "Fools," loud enough for everyone to hear, but the decision was made. Clara had been officially, publicly censured. She did not flinch. Her expression did not change. She looked at Elijah, and he looked at her. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a fierce, burning pride. Without another word, she turned. Elijah, leaning heavily on his crutch, turned with her, and together, side by side, they began to walk down the aisle. The crowd parted before them. No one spoke. No one met their eyes. They walked past the benches of their accusers, past the silent, shamed faces of those who had not spoken up for them. They walked with their heads held high, their shoulders straight, their steps in perfect, silent unison. They walked out of the hall and into the cold, clear air, leaving the council to its hollow, righteous victory. They had lost the vote, but they had not been defeated. They walked away from the town hall, leaving the murmuring crowd and the smell of stale self-righteousness behind them. They did not look back. The setting sun cast their long shadows before them, two solitary figures moving in perfect, silent step. Elijah leaned on his crutch, each step a testament to his injury, and Clara walked beside him, her hand hovering near his arm, ready to steady him, though he never faltered. They did not speak. There was nothing that needed to be said. The walk was not one of defeat, but of departure. They were leaving the town and its petty judgments behind, not by fleeing, but by simply choosing a different path. They passed her small shop, its windows dark, the neatly stitched sign a relic of a life she was already leaving behind. They passed the hotel where she had spent her first terrified nights. They continued to the end of the street, to the livery that smelled of hay and honest labor, and to the small, Spartan quarters behind it that had become first a sick room, then a sanctuary, and now, finally, a home. Inside, the small room was cool and filled with the gathering shadows of twilight, while Elijah eased himself into a chair, his face tight with the pain of the long walk. Clara moved with a quiet, practiced grace. She lit the lamp on the table, its golden glow pushing back the darkness. She stirred the embers in the small hearth and added fresh logs, coaxing a small, cheerful fire to life. The flames crackled, a warm and living sound in the profound quiet. She prepared a simple meal of bread and the last of the chicken broth Martha had brought, moving about the small space with an air of belonging that felt as natural as breathing. They ate in a comfortable silence, the firelight dancing on their faces, the world outside the town, the council, the whispers ceasing to exist. Here, within these four walls, was the only country that mattered. After they had eaten and she had cleared away the plates, they sat before the fire. Elijah's splinted leg was propped on a stool, and his crutch leaned against the wall like a resting sentinel. Clara sat on a small rug on the hearth, close enough to feel the warmth of the flames on her skin. The firelight softened the hard lines of Elijah's face, and in the flickering shadows, she could see the deep weariness in his eyes. He had stood for her, and it had cost him. The strength that had carried her through the council meeting, the cold, hard resolve that had been her shield, began to dissolve in the warmth and safety of the small room. A tremor started in her hands. She had won, in a way. She had spoken her truth and stood her ground, but she had also lost. She was an official outcast, a pariah by decree, and she had tied this good, quiet man to her fate. She had made him an outcast, too. A familiar, cold tendril of fear, the fear she had lived with for years, curled in her stomach. The public battles were one thing, but this, the quiet moment after, was where the deepest doubts resided. She turned to look at him, her heart aching with the weight of it all. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a raw, trembling whisper, the sound of a woman who had been strong for too long and was afraid her strength had finally run out. Elijah. He looked at her, his gray eyes soft in the firelight. "After all of this," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the flames. "The town, the vote, my past, which will never truly leave me. Everything they think I am, everything I truly am." She finally forced herself to look at him, her eyes shimmering with a vulnerable, desperate plea. "Do you still want me?" Knowing all of it. The question hung in the air between them, fragile and absolute. It was the last lock on the last hidden door of her heart, and she was handing him the key, terrified he might refuse to turn it. Elijah did not answer with words. Not at first. He leaned forward, a movement that was slow and deliberate because of his injury, and reached out his hand. He did not touch her arm or her shoulder. His calloused, work-roughened fingers came to rest gently against her cheek, his thumb stroking away the single tear that had escaped and traced a path through the soot on her skin. The touch was unbelievably tender, a silent answer that spoke more than 1,000 speeches. He looked into her eyes, and she saw in his gaze the end of a long and lonely road. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate right through her. "I told you once, a long time ago, that I am a simple man. I don't have a taste for fancy things, or for fancy truths." He leaned a little closer, his hand still cradling her face as if she were something precious. "I never needed a pretty truth," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I just needed it to be yours." He let the words sink in, a healing balm on the oldest of her wounds. He had seen all of it, her past, her pain, her defiance, her fear, and he was not turning away. He was leaning in. Clara closed her eyes, and for the first time in more years than she could count, she exhaled. It was not the sharp, anxious breath of a woman bracing for a blow. It was not the shuddering sigh of a woman enduring her fate. It was a long, slow, deep release. The sound of a burden finally being set down. The sound of a soul coming to rest. She opened her eyes and leaned into his touch, the warmth of his hand a steady anchor in the quiet room. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and for the first time, the sound was not lonely at all. It was just the sound of the world, going on, around the small, quiet space where she was finally, truly, safe. Thank you so much for listening to our story. If you enjoyed it, please let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love to see how far these tales travel. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach even more people, please also consider hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.